Welcome to Puppies, Pandemics, and Public Health. I am Dr. Johnny Lieberman. If you've ever wondered how your everyday choices, including what you eat, what you buy, what you wear, and the medicines you take, impact your health, the health of your family, animals, and the planet, you are in the right place. Let's get to it. Cynthia von Schlichten, thank you so much for joining today on the Puppies, Pandemics, and Public Health podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So, I'd like to ask you first, Cynthia, if there were one piece of information or one important fact you'd like to share that you make sure our listeners absolutely don't miss from the show, what would that be?
So the two most important things that I want people to take away from this is one, most of the laws that dictate welfare conditions for farm animals in the United States are federal and they're inadequate. I think that'll probably become more clear in the course of this hour, but they're definitely inadequate and we need to come up with a way to meaningfully protect these animals better. The second major thing that I think people in the movement are aware of, but maybe other people are not aware, are chickens or birds, I should say, are not protected at all by any of the laws that protect farmed animals. Chickens are slaughtered at 1 million per hour in the United States, and they are not protected under the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, and they're not protected under the transport laws. They're also not protected under the Animal Welfare Act. They're just not considered animals by definition, and that's how they get around that. So that's a really important thing to know and something that really needs to be remedied.
There's some really important information there. I want to stop for a second to pause. So, 1 million chickens per hour. Is that correct? Is that across the country?
Yeah.
Okay. So, try and imagine that. I have a hard time getting my head around that number. Across the country, there are 1 million chickens slaughtered for food per hour. To me, that's mind boggling. It's hard to get your head around the scale of how quickly and the volume of these animals being slaughtered. Do you have an idea of how fast per minute that is on any individual facility or per
Well,
hour?
it's interesting you would mention line speed because not only with chickens, but with pigs, and pigs are slaughtered at a rate of 1,106 per hour. Chickens will be much faster than that. But the reason why I mention the pigs is currently the current administration has a pilot program in place that allows slaughter facilities to forego any kind of cap on the speed at which animals go through the slaughter line for chickens and for pigs. So the cap for pigs is 1,106 per hour, but currently they're looking to eliminate that entirely so that there is no cap and they can go as fast as they want.
Wow. And that's in one single facility. For example, we're talking about over 1,000 pigs being slaughtered per hour, right?
Yeah.
Correct? To me, as someone who's learned of that recently, that's just mind boggling. It's over 1,000 pigs an hour. It's probably over 2,000 chickens an hour at a facility. It's staggering. I want you to just try and get your head around that number as we move through the rest of the
Mhm,
talk. And so, what
mhm.
is the federal law you're referring to that governs this?
So there's one law that oversees welfare considerations during
Mm.
slaughter, and that's the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. And it's the only law we have that dictates welfare requirements for slaughter, but it does not apply to chickens as they are not considered animals under the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. It doesn't consider fish either, which are slaughtered in the trillions.
The Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, if you listen to the name, it sounds like a pretty good act, right? We're going to define some welfare standards for the humane slaughter of animals. The fact
Mhm.
that chickens are excluded, what's an estimate of the percent of chickens that make up the land animals slaughtered for food?
95 or more percent of terrestrial or land animals that are slaughtered for food are chickens. They're excluded from the definition of animal under the Animal Welfare Act. Chickens are excluded from the definition of animal under the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, even though they're the animal that is slaughtered the majority of the time.
When I first learned about this as a law student, it took me a little while to get my head around the concept. So for lay people, we think of
Mhm.
an animal as an animal. As Cynthia is pointing out, in the eyes of the law, that's not always the case.
Right.
Chickens, which make up well over 90, maybe 95% of the animals slaughtered for food, are not covered under the law. Does that not seem
Right.
ridiculous to you? But that's the law. Am I understanding that correctly? A law designed to supposedly ensure animals get slaughtered humanely doesn't cover well over 90% of the animals.
Correct. When I talk about it, I say, well, what are they? If they're not animals, what are they? They have to be something. It's just a way to get around having to be accountable for their welfare.
Any idea how that came to be? That just seems ludicrous to me to design a law and then exclude 95% of what should be covered. How does that happen?
I mean, I think that's kind of always been the way. And usually when I talk about it, I do talk about the Animal Welfare Act because I feel like it kind of sets the tone for this whole just saying they're not animals. That's the case for the Animal Welfare Act. It's also the case for the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. It's also the case for the 28-hour law, which is the transport law. Chickens are excluded. It seems to just be a way that the government has figured out that allows this industry to move forward with really no accountability for the majority of animals it's overseeing.
Do you think the food industry may have had any role in helping to design that law or get these exclusions?
The factory farming industry is a multi-trillion dollar industry, and the government is definitely benefiting from that relationship and from its existence. So it's certainly in the government's best interest to make things easier for that industry. And that's kind of been the case. Factory farming rose in the mid 20th century.
So chickens not protected either under the Animal Welfare Act, another federal law, or the Humane
Mhm.
Methods of Slaughter Act. Can you give an example of how that harms the animals or the kind of slaughter that they may be going through on a regular basis that maybe in comparison to a cow, say, that has at least some protections? Just give an example of it's the animals moving along the line there. There's a humane way to do it in theory that is
Yep.
probably somewhat less horrible. And then there's the example of a chicken that's got no regulation and it sounds like a free for all. I would speculate the industry can do whatever they want, which is probably the cheapest way to get the animal through and processed into food. What's the process and what's missing? I would say that maybe cows enjoy, if you want to use that word loosely, for a privilege in the slaughter process.
Right. So the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act technically requires stunning. So all of the animals if they're covered under the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, all of the animals that go through the slaughter process are supposed to be stunned ahead of time. In theory, they would not be aware of anything they're going through when it comes down to the
Stunned,
actual
rendered
slaughter,
unconscious, correct?
right? Render unconscious. So technically that is supposed to be happening. So that is a big thing that non-chickens basically or fish are enjoying when they go through the slaughter process. Now there's problems with that. It's not always happening anyway. And then with increased line speeds, it's harder to make sure the animals are properly stunned as they go through. And they're also reducing the number of government related inspectors to monitor the holding. So they're putting workers in charge of that who aren't really equipped to do that or able. So there's lots of problems with compliance. But on paper, they're supposed to be stunned. So that is obviously much better. And with chickens, they don't have to be stunned. Now, some companies will just do it anyway, but legally, they don't really have to do it at all. They can just send them through the process, the whole step, all the steps involved with the slaughter process, completely conscious.
And the way that they're killed is a throat slit.
So it depends, but one of the things that happens is with chickens is the throat will be slit, but then another thing that they do is drop them in scalding water. It helps to remove the feathers. So if they're so conscious at that point, now they've had their throat slit and they're being dropped in scalding water and all of that is conscious. So yeah, that's pretty common with chickens and how they are handled at that point.
Is it in the billions of birds per year that are going
Yeah.
through that? So billions of
Yeah, some
birds.
9 billion birds are slaughtered for food in North America per year on average.
Wow. I'm not sure that many of the listeners have had any clue of the process. These are living sentient beings, and at a minimum for other animals that are covered, at least they're rendered unconscious before a horrific
Well, they're
death.
supposed to be.
They're supposed to be, and even that is
Right,
far from perfect, as you pointed out. The
right,
chickens don't stand a chance. They're
right.
going through throat
Correct.
slit, dipped into the scalding hot water, possibly while they're still alive. I
Conscious.
think
Yeah,
routinely that's probably happening.
yeah.
And I want everyone to just think about that for a bit. Next time you're going to buy chicken, keep that in mind. It's just mind blowing.
Yeah, and like I said, that law is certainly not without its compliance issues. At least if you're not a chicken, you have a chance and maybe it being a little less terrible. Of course, that doesn't account for the lack of compliance and how you're raised and the transport and all of that. But hopefully, in theory, you're at least unconscious when you're going through the worst of the slaughter process.
And so turkeys are part of that bird category that's accepted from that as well,
Right.
as we're
Yep.
coming up to Thanksgiving, not too far away. Yeah.
Right.
Let's shift to the cows. I am under their understanding that to enforce this Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, there are supposed to be government inspectors at every single slaughterhouse observing every single slaughter. Is that correct?
I don't know if they're observing every single slaughter, but there are supposed to be inspectors who are generally keeping an eye that sort of the process is running properly, that animals are being stunned, that sick animals or downed animals are being pulled from the line and they're supposed to be humanely euthanized. So inspectors are supposed to be kind of overseeing all of that to make sure that the animals are healthy enough to go through slaughter and that the slaughter is happening right and that everybody's being stunned and that the downed animals are being pulled. That's what the inspectors are supposed to be doing. But the current administration has a pilot program is trying to basically reduce the number of government inspectors significantly and have the workers learn how to do all of that. So now the workers are in charge of managing these crazy fast slaughter speeds. And it's very dangerous work to begin with. And they're obviously not skilled to the level the inspectors are, but now they're also supposed to be monitoring all of these other things to make sure it's happening. And the government is saying, well, then we just reserve the inspectors for the really serious, like really technical work, but it's really just a way to allow the industry to be self-policing and just kind of go about their way and not have to be monitored or worry about complying with anything. I mean, that's the reality of this new rule.
There are regulatory
Yeah.
bodies in place, and deferring it to a worker who may already be overworked, stressed, probably underpaid. And I would suspect there's a huge amount of pressure to just not report anything. Can you speak a little bit about downed animals, why that might happen, and if there's a risk to the public for downed animals getting into the food supply, if perhaps they're not inspected and they're just moved along into the food supply?
So the thing with downed animals is it's actually illegal to allow cows that are downed to get into the food supply chain because they have found that downed cows can be tied to mad cow disease. Mad cow disease is obviously very bad for business. So they have decided that is not okay. So if a cow is downed, it cannot go through the supply chain.
They being
And
the
so my
federal government has decided that's not
yes,
okay, correct?
yes, the government, yes. So the cows cannot go through this chain. And my guess is they probably are fairly conscientious about that because bad kidney disease is a nightmare for everyone. So they want to be mindful that does not happen again. With regard to other animals, there actually aren't any rules that they can't go through the process. They can't go into the supply chain.
I didn't know that the driving force is mad cow disease, which is, as you pointed out, really from a business perspective.
Yeah,
And
right.
perhaps that's a motivating factor for complying more than anything else.
Yeah, mad cow disease is actually a driver of some of the rules around the 28-hour law, the transport law as well.
What federal laws are there to protect animals before they get to slaughter and before they go to transport? while they're being raised and fattened to get turned into food.
There are some rules that dictate the quality of the end product, such as the Federal Meat Inspection Act or the Poultry Products Inspection Act. Both of those are kind of centered around making sure that the end result is something safe and marketable for people. But they are technically governed by animal cruelty laws as well.
These are state laws.
Like there's state laws like Proposition 12 in California, they create higher welfare and they have all kinds of specific rules about what you can and cannot do in terms of how these animals are raised and cared for. From a federal perspective, there's not a whole lot there as far as protecting the animals and dictating how they can be raised.
So very little in the way of federal protections, if any. If I understood, the laws on the books are more for protecting the public from food quality and safety issues, not so
Yeah.
much farmed animal welfare, ensuring a certain standard of treatment. State laws potentially can address it. They vary state by state with many exclusions, as you pointed out. I would think that it would be very difficult to bring charges under an animal cruelty law. Am I right? It would be the
Yeah.
state prosecuting, not an
Yeah.
individual bringing a suit. What's the interest in the state in prosecuting these crimes, and what's the level of information that you need to obtain to even enforcement of protections for these animals?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard, and obviously it varies by jurisdiction. Some places are going to be a little more sensitive to those issues than others. But I mean, in general, you have to have pretty concrete information of really egregious abuse that goes beyond the industry standard because the industry standard it gets you out of worrying about animal cruelty laws. So if it's an industry standard, it's fine. That's why it's fine to cut a chicken's throat when it's conscious. That's an industry standard. But if the facility or the entity is going beyond that in terms of cruelty and it's just not an industry standard, they're just violating animal cruelty laws, then you can try to make a case for that. But you need to have really compelling information and you need to be able to sell the district attorney on bothering with it. And then the other thing is if it's a small area, that government, even if it's a small government like a county or something, they have interests too. They might be motivated by those farmers, by the big company. They have more of a stake in their welfare than in your personal welfare in your case that you think these animals are being mistreated. Well, yeah, but this is a big company that brings a lot of revenue into our area and we don't want to cross them. And we have 20 million other cases to worry about. So we're not gonna bother with this one. I mean, that's pretty common, but you can make the case it does happen. It's just really very difficult, and it depends on a lot of different factors.
As you pointed out, the prosecution needs to be in the interest of the state, and that's the state being local. And so I
Mm.
think that's a good point. The prosecutor might not think it's in the best interest of his people or constituents to bring that up. Can you give a few examples of what are considered normal husbandry practices, which I think the average person would think horrific or cruelty, or certainly it will be a prosecutable crime if you did that to your neighbor's dog or cat?
Well, I think about the 28-hour law, which we're gonna talk about in a minute. The basic provision in the 28-hour law says that animals can travel for 28 hours at one time without food, water, and rest before being offloaded for 5 hours for food, water, and rest. And if you did that to your dog or cat and didn't feed it for 28 hours and left it in a tiny little thing and horrible conditions and it's super cold and all of those things, that might rise to the level of animal cruelty. Another thing I just thought of that's a really good example is ventilation shutdown. And I don't know how much people are familiar with ventilation shutdown, but that's essentially where they wanna kill a bunch of animals at one time in a particular farm or wherever, and so they basically lock them all into one space, cut off all the air supply, and cook them to death, and I apologize for whoever that horrifies, it is pretty horrifying, but often that gets compared to the hot car thing. If you
Hmm.
leave your dog in a hot car, not only is that animal cruelty, but a lot of states have rules that say you can break in a passerby or can break into that car and get that animal out, and they will not be held accountable for anything they do, any damage they cause, because that is so egregious. But here we have an industry standard, and it's more and more an industry standard in the US in particular. Most places have been the way we do it. but it's an industry standard to literally cook tens of thousands of animals to death. And it's a horrible process and it can take them up to 16 hours to die. But that's fine. That's an industry standard. But if you did that to your dog, left it in a hot car for a half hour, someone can break into your car and take that animal out with no repercussions. I mean, there's a huge disparity there, obviously.
Ventilation Shutdown Plus, I just want to emphasize that to those of my listeners who haven't heard of it, which is probably everybody.
Mm,
And as Cynthia pointed out, the other term for it is mass depopulation, where
mhm,
animals are trapped in a barn or a facility, as Cynthia pointed out. Ventilation is shut off, the term, and they're suffocated and or literally cooked to death. It's a slow
mhm,
and painful process. And other points that Cynthia may be able to comment on, which I find especially egregious. One is our National Veterinary Association in the country, the American Veterinary Medical Association, the veterinary equivalent of what I'm familiar with, the American Medical Association, a giant group of doctors and administrators, in theory, advocating for doctors' interests and patient interests. So the AVMA, the American Veterinary Medical Association, has signed off on this procedure in certain situations. They have their stamp on it, and perhaps that's connected to the fact that the government says it's okay and the government pays for it to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars over the
right.
course of a year. That's our taxpayer dollars funding this horrific mass slaughter of animals on a routine basis. I, as a taxpayer and as someone who has a pet and trusts in general the American Veterinary Medical Association as a respected body,
Mhm.
this really questions that in my mind. Can they be trusted? Should you listen to them? And the fact that my taxpayer dollars are going there. Do you have any comments or reflections on either of those points, Cynthia?
I mean, for sure. I always grew up thinking the AVMA was like an ally to animals. But as I have come to learn, at least in the realm of farmed animals, they're an ally to the farmed animal, factory farm industry and to the government, not to animals themselves. The fact that they put their stamp on ventilation shutdown or ventilation shutdown plus at any point is concerning. But actually, the language they use to determine if it's okay to use it or not is very vague, which is a typical lawyer thing. A lawyer probably drafted it, but it says it can be used in constrained circumstances. And then they go on to define what that means. And it used to be that ventilation shutdown was used for a pandemic, like a bird flu or something like that, some huge outbreak. And there's a whole bunch of problems with that, which I'll talk about in a second, that you referenced about the taxpayers paying for it. But it's kind of been relaxed over the years in the US, and now it's at the point where pretty much the industry just can use it anytime. And I don't call it depopulation, I call it mass execution. But they want to mass execute the animals. They can justify it saying it's a constrained circumstance, which is just a really vague term. And they do define it a little bit, but I don't think they do a very good job. And I'm sure that's not an accident. So that's very concerning. And then to your point about the government paying for it through livestock indemnity payments. So basically, if the industry kills all of these animals, the government will only reimburse them for animals that die. So, putting pandemics aside, if there's a hurricane or something and a bunch of the animals are stuck in the barn and a bunch of them die and the rest are not marketable, they have to kill those animals if they want to get paid from the government. Otherwise, they won't get paid. So they can't just find them a home or something like that, or find some other way to spare these animals that are not marketable anymore. It's set up so that they can only get paid if they actually kill them. And with regard to pandemics, they want to keep their testing to a minimum because the animals that test positive, they do not get paid for. So typically, if they find bird flu, and they want to test for bird flu, and they would test a few in their flock, and then they would determine, oh, there's a few, now we have to mass execute everyone, and then they'll get paid for all of the ones that they mass executed except a couple that tested positive. So you kind of test just enough to get the green light to mass execute, but that's it. Because if you test too much and you have too many that have it, then you start to lose money. So, just for a little statistic, from 1995 to 2024, the Farm Service Agency, which is part of the US government, paid out $791 million through livestock indemnity payments, which is what we're talking about here. And often those are tied to ventilation shutdown and ventilation shutdown plus. I mean,
That
it's
was
appalling. Most countries absolutely ban, nobody uses what we use. And they say it's because ours is inhumane. And everyone's gotten the memo except the US, pretty much.
the US is the outlier on this.
Yeah, I mean, other countries have forms of mass execution, like the EU has one. They fill the facility with nitrogen foam, so they basically go to sleep and die. So they're at least sleeping when they die, which is still terrible, obviously, but better than being conscious and being cooked to death over 16
Mm.
hours.
I'm not sure that numbers are still being tracked as much as they were in the past, but last time I checked, as of a number of months ago, the number of birds slaughtered as a result of it and thus reimbursed via indemnification was well
Mhm.
over 170 million. And to me, that's a massive amount of suffering and a massive amount of animals. And it's staggering. We're paying for horrific suffering. We're all financing it. I wanted to go back briefly, touch on animal husbandry, just at least briefly to give the public an idea of what that means. It was practices that I think everyone else in the country would probably consider abhorrent and cruel
Mhm.
and would certainly be criminal if you inflicted them on your dog or cat
Yeah.
or your neighbor's dog. I mean, I learned some new terms, debeaking those birds. The pigs have their tails cut off routinely without anesthesia, their teeth
Right.
ground down as babies routinely
Right.
without anesthesia. Something we else cow branding, right?
Right.
That's a routine part of it. Declawing. There's just this long list of castration of male pigs as juvenile pigs routinely without anesthesia. And
Right.
the
And forced molting is another great example. That's something they do with chickens to promote egg production, and they'll basically leave them in the dark with no food. And
that's it. Forced molting. That doesn't sound too bad, but the reality, as we know, is something.
yeah, no, it's pretty bad. And your point about the pigs is a great example because with pigs, yes, they will clip their teeth and dock their tails, and the same with the debeaking. And you would say, well, why would we do that? Because these animals are in such confined quarters and they're so stressed and the conditions are so bad that their coping mechanism is to nip at each other sometimes, and that hurts the product, right? So instead of just creating a better environment where the animals aren't stressed and freaking out all the time, they just cut off their ability to engage in that coping mechanism.
And the kind of greenwashing, if that's the right word for it, that I've heard from the industry, and I'm sure you've heard, is it's done to protect the animals from attacking each other and hurting each other. If they weren't in this horrible situation of confinement and stress, they wouldn't want to be doing that in the first place. It's just flipped on its head as if the farmers are doing the animals a favor.
Right, that's like what we would say humane washing, but I think people are unaware that these things are happening or understand why they're happening, and so they might hear something that just take it at face value, but if you think about it a little bit, you'd realize that all they're doing is protecting their own interests, the farmer or the company, they're not protecting the animal. They could just give them more space or give them something that would make them less stressed and miserable. The pigs are super smart and they're social. So if you lock them up in little crates where they can't turn around or move or do anything but stand there all day, if there's a solution, they're just not taking it because this is cheaper and easier and quicker.
The simple concept of more space fixes so much of this.
It would help a lot.
Yeah, and those are considered normal husbandry.
Right.
They're not illegal under most state laws because there's exceptions. That's just an accepted part of the business.
Right. Yep. Those are great examples of that.
All right, Cynthia, I know you want to get on to the 28-hour law. I want to hear a bit more about it too. So we do have a law in the books called the 28-hour law that regulates transport of farmed animals. And maybe
To
you're
slaughter.
like me, you're thinking 28-hour law, that sounds like an arbitrary number. But let's go. Cynthia, tell us a little bit more about that law, and does it really protect the animals, and is it doing what it's supposed to?
So I don't think the 28-hour law exists to protect the animals. I think the 28-hour law exists to make sure that that is a marketable product at the other end of that transport. And I think that's what it's about. The 28-hour law says that the animals can be transported to slaughter. It's only to slaughter for up to 28 hours at one time without food, water, or rest before they have to be offloaded for 5 hours for food, water, and rest. And there's a bunch of exclusions, and the transporter can get an extension of time if they want to. That does not improve the conditions for the animals. They don't get like a longer break or food on the way or something like that. It's just a longer time. And then there's other exceptions to the 28-hour law, like it doesn't apply to or from Mexico or Canada unless you're talking about cow. And we already know that mad cow disease is bad for business. So that's why the 28-hour law applies there. If you're transporting pigs or other bovines from Mexico or Canada, they're actually prohibited from stopping until they get to their destination, even if it's way over 28 hours, because they have not found that harms the bottom line. And the thing about the 28-hour law is there's really no
So,
incentive
excuse me, to
to
interrupt. They being the government or they being the industry? Because the law is written by the
they
government.
right, but the industry is who is transporting animals. So the government says, yes, the government says only applies to cows to or from Mexico or Canada. If it's pigs or other bovines, forget birds, birds are excluded completely. If it's pigs or other bovines and they're traveling to or from Mexico or Canada, they cannot stop until they get to where they're going, even if it's over 28 hours. That's the government saying that. The industry did comply with the 28-hour law, so it's really not an issue. And the government doesn't enforce it.
The industry does
Yep.
or does not comply with the law routinely.
They do not comply at all. There is no incentive to comply. And the government does not enforce it, literally. The industry does not comply with the 28-hour law. For example, the maximum penalty for violation of the 28-hour law is a $500 fine per occurrence. An occurrence is a truckload of animals. And that doesn't happen anyway. So if you have a multi-million dollar contract with a slaughter facility on the other side of the country, do you think you're going to be worried about the 28-hour law and the $500 fine that you're never going to get? Of course not. You're going to want to make sure you meet your deadline with that slaughter facility on the other side of the country because that contract is worth way more than $500. So why would they comply? I wouldn't. Why would they?
Right.
Compliance is pretty much non-existent. There's been studies about level of compliance with violations reported and such. And basically there was like over a year period, there was one incident violation that actually made it all the way to the Department of Justice. But even in those cases, the companies usually get a letter just saying they violated it and they shouldn't, even if they're a repeat offender. The 28-hour law is really terrible. And of course, it doesn't apply to birds at all.
That does sound like a completely worthless law. If I can summarize, it's not designed to protect the animals at all. It's really designed for industry. It's not enforced. It's meaningless.
Yeah. Honestly, the whole thing about it only applying to cows to or from Mexico or Canada tells you what the law's about. If it was about animal welfare, then it would apply to everybody all the time, or at least the non-bird animals that it initially applies to. But the fact that it only applies to cows because cows are where we're at issue of affecting the bottom line and the marketability of the product, that's why it applies.
And I think it's accepted or a normal death rate if on
Yeah.
these long trips. They just write off, we're going to lose, and maybe the number 5% or
Yeah.
10% of animals as a cost of
So
doing business. Does that sound about right?
I can give you an idea. So on average, every year, 20 million chickens, 330,000 pigs, and 66,000 cattle on average die in transport.
I don't know what to say. That's just
Now,
tragic. And I want to paint the picture. When was the last time that you were trapped and confined in a space where you couldn't move for 28 hours. When you drive, if you get on a road trip, how often
I
do you
think
just stop and stretch your
I
legs and go to the bathroom even?
I think about planes. Imagine sitting in the middle seat for 28 hours and they're not giving you anything to drink and you can't go to the bathroom. I mean, those animals probably go in the truck, honestly, but you can't get up, you
You could
can't
go
do
with the middle
anything.
seat too if you wanted to.
Right. And at least the middle seat, there's some temperature control. There's no temperature control on those trucks. So, like, you're in the middle seat, there's no heat, there's no air conditioner, there's no food, there's no water. You can't get up for 28 hours. Then you get off for 5 hours, and then you have to get back on that middle seat for another 28. I mean, does that sound like something you'd want to do? And the middle seat is honestly still better than what we're talking about.
Coming up close to the end here, I just wanted to summarize a little bit for our listeners before we conclude. For the majority of the time that farmed animals are alive, they have no protections. Time of birth to getting fattened until they get on the transport truck to be slaughtered, to free for all. Industries can act, they do these normal husbandry practices on a routine basis, often without anesthesia, confining the animals in extremely tight confinement, close conditions. And then once it's time to get transported to slaughter, we have an extremely impotent law, the 28-hour law, which does little, if anything, to protect them, as we learned. And then about 95% of the animals slaughtered for food aren't even protected at the time of slaughter. To me, that sounds like well beyond a broken
Yeah.
system. I think most people had a different view of it. Surely there's some animal protections. I know they don't have a great life on a farm, but it's probably not that bad. The laws on the books are minimal, very ineffective, poorly enforced, and really designed to protect the business model more so than the animals and even the health of the public, which is linked to a lot of this as well. They're interconnected. Cynthia, I'll let you close here. Any other final points you'd like to make? If we've touched a nerve or we inspired some interest, what should our listeners do to learn more? Or is there anything they can do to maybe make different choices in their routine?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way to avoid being part of this system at all is to just not eat animals or animal products. But if you still want to eat animal products, I encourage you to go to your local farm, see the farm, walk around the farm, see what the environment is like. Local small farmer, go to them. Do 95 probably percent of the food that you see in restaurants, in stores, is from a factory farm, and it's all the stuff we're talking about today. And this isn't even like the worst of the worst. This is just the regular day to day. So if you want to avoid that, but you're not ready to give up animal products, go to your local farm, but really walk around, see what it's like, and then buy from them. Don't buy from the factory farms.
This is a way to make a difference and not support this horrific industry.
Educate yourself more about it. That's the other thing. I mean, if you learn all about this and you're fine with it, then I guess you don't have anything to worry about where your food's coming from. But if this bothers you, there's more to learn about it and educate yourself so you know what you're supporting. And again, if you want to keep eating meat, just go to your local farm, walk around, because these factory farms are killing the local farmers as well. I mean, that's a whole other podcast, but they are killing the local farmer. So if you want to help that local farmer, go there. Do not buy from the big companies.
Right. The number of small local family farms has been gradually decreasing over time, getting put out of
Significantly. Yeah.
business by these big agribusinesses. And that's another whole podcast for why that's happening and how it's being enabled by our government largely and our taxpayer dollars. But there is a
Right.
way around it. Cynthia and I are trying to provide you with information. Look into it further. If something piqued your interest, that's one change you can make. Still eat the meat you like, but support a local farmer and support an industry that's not nearly as cruel as the factory farm industry. It might even taste better. It's probably going to be healthier for you and maybe have less risk of picking up a disease from it as well. Any other points, Cynthia? Or would you like to close here and drop something for your farm sanctuary?
Yeah, I mean, I encourage everyone to check out our website, farmsanctuary.org. We have all kinds of information about the stuff we talked about today and a host of other things. We also have 2 farms, one in California near Los Angeles and one in upstate New York, where we house hundreds of farmed animals that came from the system in one form or another. You can come to the farms, you can visit, you can meet the animals and learn more about who they are as individuals. We also do a lot of humane education work, and there's lots to learn on our website, and encourage you to follow us on social media. And you can certainly reach out to me at Farm Sanctuary if you have any follow-up questions.
Check out the Farm Sanctuary website. Lots of great work they're doing for animals there. It can perhaps expand your world and get an idea of farmed animals as individual beings and not just something
Yeah,
that gets turned into a meal on your plate.
yeah,
Cynthia, thanks
exactly.
so much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure having you, hearing your thoughts, your expertise. Thanks so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. These conversations aren't always easy, but they're important and worth having. Take what resonates, ask questions, and keep learning. Find us on Doctor Podcast Network.